Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of Teardown. Today we're going to be tearing down the LAMZU Thorn V2. Now, for the Thorn being my first experience with any of LAMZU's products, I'm very impressed as the overall quality of the mouse is amazing. It's not perfect, of course, but it's a very solid mouse with lots of great features, solid performance, and a fantastic shaping, which as you can kind of tell by looking at it here, is basically a larger outside AX shaping. It's not one for one, but it's very close, being the closest I've ever felt on a mouse to date. And due to the addition of the internal support skeleton, which LAMZU is calling their task skeleton, the Thorn is admittedly a little bit more complex, being similar to the internal build quality and complexity of the GPX series mice or Vaxi's Gen 2 series mice, meaning that some aspects of the mouse is a little bit tricky to service in some regards, but as long as you're careful, the mouse is serviceable. And in today's video, I'll be guiding you all how to fully disassemble and reassemble the Thorn V2 along with its orbiter receiver, so you can mod or repair the mouse without damaging it. But before we get started, as always, you will need a couple tools. Having an electronic focus repair screwdriver set is recommended, as it will contain all the drivers and bits needed to work on a mouse or any other electronic product. Now, thankfully, all the screws inside the Thorn V2 are Phillips heads bits, but they are on the smaller side, hence why I recommend getting a set like this iFixit kit here or something comparable. And for bits required for this teardown, you'll need a PH000 along with a PH0 screwdriver bit, again Phillips heads, to tear down the mouse. I would also highly recommend having a plastic pry tool like this to open the top and base shells, as well as having a plastic pry bar like this, as it makes it easy to remove the internal skeleton. And lastly, I would highly recommend getting a silicone soldering mat like this one or a similar work mat. Now, personally speaking, I like to use a soldering mat as number one, it's anti-static and it also has component and screw storage built into it, but you can use pretty much whatever surface you want to take apart the mouse. Just make sure the work area is anti-static and you have a way of accurately tracking the components and the screws from inside the mouse. And as a final note before we get started, keep in mind that opening your mouse within its manufacturer warranty will void it entirely. So if your mouse is under manufacturer warranty, please keep this in mind and only continue with the disassembly process if you're okay voiding your mouse's warranty coverage. But with that little disclaimer out of the way and with all your tools assembled, you're ready to go ahead and tear down the LAMZU Thorn V2 along with its dongle, so let's go ahead and get started. Alrighty, starting off by grabbing our PH000 bit, we're going to go ahead and flip the mouse over. Now to open the mouse, you will need to remove both the top and base gates, as the access holes for the screws are located underneath them. On a future LAMZU product, I'd love to see them include skates that didn't need to be removed or had a hole in them so they'd be easier to access these ports here, but that's a pretty minimal nitpick. But regardless, once the skates are removed, we can go ahead and remove 4 screws from the base here. Now as a quick note, on both of my units, the screws at the front of the shell are held in quite tightly, so they might not come out of the shell when you disconnect them. So unscrew them until they feel loose, and that should be enough to get the shells disconnected. Alright, and with that note, we can go ahead and remove the 4 base screws. Alright, and then with those removed, go ahead and make a pincer with your fingers and put pressure on the side shells right here and here. And with enough pressure, you'll see that the bottom corner of the shell right here will kind of open up, just enough for you to stick a pry tool inside it. And once you do, you can fold it up and over to disconnect the back clamp, and then you can run along the side of the shells to disconnect the clamp on the side here as well, just like that. And the same thing on the opposite side, in from the back, around the top, just like that. And with that, you can separate the top and base shells. However, as you can see, there is a very large ribbon cable here, so be mindful of that. And we can disconnect this quite easily by just grabbing the sides of this connector and pulling up, just like that, and then gently pulling the ribbon cable up and out of its connector. Alright, and then with that disconnected, that is how you disconnect the top and base shells here on the Thorn V2. Now we're going to go ahead and put the base shell off to the side for now, and let's focus on the top shell next. Alright, now for the top shell disassembly here, as you can see, due to the added task skeleton or just internal support skeleton structure here, the build of the top shell is a little more complex than what we've seen on more modern mice with more modern skeleton structures. However, it's still serviceable. Its disassembly process is just very similar to the complexity of the GPX series or Vaxi's older mice, both of which use similar, larger supporting skeletons. Now to remove the skeleton structure, we're going to go ahead and remove 5 screws from the top shell. Firstly, the 3 screws here, here, and here, and then we're also going to remove the anchoring screw for the main clicks that goes here and here. Alright, and then once those screws are removed, we're going to go ahead and flip the shell over, and you want to press on the main clicks right at their top region right here. So you just want to press them into the shell like that, and with a little bit of pressure, you see they sink into the top shell, and there's a small gap between their surface and the top shell surface. Once that's done, flip the shell over and take a pry tool and gently go under the click and just kind of pull it up. Just be very careful to not damage this tiny little ribbon cable that runs right here, but with a little bit of pressure, the click will pop out of the shell, and we'll do the same thing for the next one. Just like that. And once removed, the main clicks will fall right out of the top shell like this. And while we have the main clicks here, I also wanted to highlight, this is where the clicks are pre-lubed by the factory. So there's a little bit of lubing right there. And there's also quite a bit added here and here. Now, since I've disassembled this unit so many times, a lot of the lubing has wore off. But if over the lifespan of the mouse, you do need to re-lube the main clicks, you can add a little bit of lube to this little hole here and here, and to these little spokes on the main clicks that are right there and there. All right, and then with that note off to the side, now we can go ahead and remove this central cage-like structure. Now, the easiest way to do this is to pull the shells open a little bit while also pulling at the back of the shell like this to gently lift it up. However, right away you'll notice there's a lot of friction from this top area here, as very similar to the other cage-like structures we've dealt with before, they are kind of installed onto these standoffs at the front of the shell. Now, unlike on other mice, the tolerance of these little standoffs is very, very, very tight, meaning there's a lot of friction, and as such, if you just try and pull the skeleton structure out, it most likely won't come up by itself. You'll need to disconnect these manually first. Now, to disconnect them, you can go ahead and grab a pry tool like this and go in from the front of the shell and just gently pull up like this, and you just want to gently pull up on both the top areas there. And with enough pressure, they'll pop right off. And then once that's removed, you can open the shell up just like that to disconnect the central cage-like structure, or the task skeleton as LAMZU is calling it. Now, before we disassemble this structure, we're going to put this off to the side for now, as there is one more component we need to remove from the top shell here, and that is the side buttons, which are installed in the typical fashion as they're anchored into these little standoffs here and here. And you can remove them quite easily by pushing them into the shell and then taking a fingernail or a pry tool and just gently pulling up on the corners. And with a little bit of pressure, the side buttons will pop out of the shell in one solid piece. Now, because the side buttons here in the Thorn V2 are uncoated, if you wanted to color or add a coating to them yourself, this makes it very easy to do so. And I also wanted to highlight, there's these really cool little dampening pads installed on the top that help prevent the clicks from making a lot of audio feedback when they slam back into the shell, which is a really cool little attention to detail I haven't seen on many mice to date. So that's another aspect of the side button design I wanted to highlight. Again, personally speaking, I think they should be a little more flattened in their surface and have a proper coating applied to them, like the coating applied to the rest of the shell. And with those changes, the side buttons would be perfect, but in their current implementation, they're still decent in my opinion. All right, with the side buttons removed, that is everything for the top shell here in the Thorn V2, so we will go ahead and put that off to the side for now. And now we can circle back to the internal task skeleton and disassemble this next. Alright, now the first thing we're going to do for this internal skeleton structure here is we're going to disconnect the main click PCB, which is actually a pretty easy process, as all it's being held in by is a small little plastic clip here. And as such, you can just take a pry tool and clip this down, push it down like that, and you can just push the side button PCB out of its little clip to disconnect it. However, as you can see, it is also held in by a small ribbon cable here, which is also easy to disconnect, as we just pull up the top of that connector just like that and pull the ribbon cable out to fully disconnect the side button PCB. Alright, and then next we can go ahead and pull this ribbon cable up and out of the top shell just like that. Next we can go ahead and remove the main click PCB, as there are 4 screws holding it in, one here, 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 and here. However, when you do this, just be mindful of the ribbon cables on the opposite side and make sure to orient it in a way where there's no pressure being added to those cables, as they are quite fragile. And then with those screws removed, just like the side button PCB, it's being held in by these very small plastic clips here. So we can just flip the shell over, take a pry tool again, and just gently pull back that little connector there to pop it off. We'll do the same on the next one as well. And with a little bit of fidgeting, the side button PCB is removed and you can take it out of the top shell just like that. Now with that removed, that is everything for the skeleton structure itself, so we can put that off to the side. And lastly, for the main click PCB here, we can also remove the scroll wheel, which you can do by just gently pinching the wheel out of the encoder here, just like that. All right, and then with this PCB, that is everything for the top shell disassembly. We'll put this off to the side for now. Next, let's circle back to the base shell and disassemble this next. Starting off, the base shell is a pretty straightforward disassembly process here as it's not too complex. Firstly, we can go ahead and disconnect the battery, which we can do by grabbing the sides of this JST connector and gently wiggling it up, and with a little bit of fidgeting, the 1.5mm JST plug will be disconnected. With that removed, now we can go ahead and remove 3 screws from the main PCB, one here, here, and here to remove it from the bottom shell. And then with those screws removed, just take a pry tool and gently pull up on the back of the PCB from these 2 contacts here. And with enough pressure, it will disconnect, and you can pull the PCB out at an angle and up like that to remove it from the little clamp towards the top here. And with that, you can remove the PCB as a whole. Now, keep in mind, this bottom slider button will likely come off with the whole thing, which is okay. You can just remove that as well. So put that off to the side. And as a quick note about the PCB here, since the antenna sticks off the PCB like this, be very careful when handling this, as if you damage the antenna, it will obviously affect the mouse's connectivity, so be sure to handle this with care. Alright, and now we can go back to the mouse's battery. Now, unless you're going to replace the battery or mod it for another one, I would not recommend removing it, as number 1, you'll need new adhesive to re-anchor it, and number 2, due to the battery's positioning being a little closer to the mouse's midline than what we commonly see, as batteries are more commonly positioned back here. If you adjust the positioning of the mouse's battery or mod it out for a larger or smaller one, it will affect the mouse's balancing, so keep that in mind. So I would not recommend removing the battery unless you're going to mod it or replace it yourself, but for thoroughness, I'm going to remove it in today's teardown video just to show you guys how to fully do it. And on that topic of the battery, there is actually a lot of install area in the back shell here for modding the mouse's battery. So if you want to put a larger or smaller capacity battery inside the mouse, there's plenty of area to do so, and there's plenty of play to its positioning. So if you end up using a smaller, lighter battery, you can put it more towards the rear region of the shell to not affect the mouse's balancing, but you'll have to manually calibrate that yourself. And as I mentioned in the full review, unfortunately LAMZU has not added any pull tab to the battery's adhesive, meaning removing it is quite tricky. Now, as always, never use any kind of metal object to remove a battery, and don't use anything sharp, as if you puncture the battery, it will catch fire. And as a rule of thumb, always use plastic tools and be very, very careful when removing these types of batteries. And with a little bit of prying, the battery comes off relatively easily, just like that. Now, of course, the adhesive on your mouse's battery might be a little different, but it was relatively easy to remove in my case, which is nice to see. Alright, and with the battery removed, that is everything for the mouse's base shell disassembly, which was actually quite easy, which is nice to see. We'll put that off to the side for now. And now we'll go ahead and grab our main PCB, the mouse's battery, the side button PCB, and of course the main click PCB, and talk about the mouse's PCB layouts and specs next. Alright, starting off with the main PCB. In the back end of the PCB here, we have the PAW Next 1 sensor, which is just a renamed PAW 3955 series sensor, the same sensor type that's being adopted by many other brands lately. And next we'll find a Nordic NRF 54H20 MCU. Now this is the more overkill version of the 54 series SoC. However, one notable improvement to this SoC over the other 54 series SoCs is that it does have a USB controller built into it. And because of this, this SoC gives the Thorn V2 native 8K polling on both its connectivity types without the need for an additional control chip, and this is the first LAMZU product to support dual 8K polling, which is a great improvement to see here. And lastly, we have a very large antenna style here, a bit larger than the ones we've seen used on other mice, but this is a dedicated antenna type, which is a great improvement to see over traced or inlaid antenna type used by other brands. And the dongle also has a dedicated antenna to pair to this, but we'll talk about that more in a moment. Moving on to the mouse's battery, the pre-production unit that I have here has a 250 mAh battery, but the retail versions will use a 300 mAh battery, but both batteries use the same 1.5mm JST connector here, which is very easy to reuse or replace if you want to mod the mouse's battery in the future. Moving on to the side button PCB, here we have 2 TTC 160 series switches, which are very similar to the brown shell blue dot switches we've seen used on other mice, just with a slightly heavier actuation weight, of course. And as I mentioned earlier, they are soldered to this PCB, but due to the PCB's modular nature, you can replace this whole thing or resolder the switches if needed. And lastly, moving on to the main click PCB, we have a set of Kale optical switches, which are a very unique optical switch type, but despite their nicheness, they are actually pretty well implemented here. But as I talked about in the full review, they don't feel or sound like traditional optical switches, so keep that in mind if you're considering the Thorn V2. Next, for the scroll wheel click, we have a full-size Wano black shell yellow dot switch, which is also well implemented, and I'm very happy to see that LAMZU used a full-size switch not a pillar switch type, as these full-size switches deliver a much better overall performance in terms of the wheel's click, feel, and rebound compared to pillar switch types. And lastly, and most notably for the wheel encoder here, unlike the mechanical encoders we commonly see, LAMZU has opted to use an optical encoder, which is a fantastic improvement to see here, and this is specifically the Reassembly E9 encoder, and as is traditional for Reassembly's components, they perform very similar to the components inside Razer's mice, and as such, this encoder feels and performs nearly identical to the Razer optical encoders found in the Viper V4 Pro and Death Adder V4 Pro, which is a great improvement to see here, as these optical encoder types are vastly superior to mechanical encoder types, although they are more expensive, and I'm very happy to see that LAMZU went for the more premium encoder type here on the Thorn V2. And lastly, as I mentioned earlier, all the components are soldered to this PCB here, meaning they are not hot swapped, but you can always solder in new components if needed, and due to this PCB's modular nature, since it's connected with ribbon cables, you can always replace the entire PCB if needed, or the ribbon cables themselves if they are damaged due to their more fragile nature. Alright, that's everything for the mouse's PCB components and specs. Next, let's go ahead and talk about the mouse's individual component weights. Starting off with component weights, the top shell with everything removed from it weighs around 13.42 grams, while the main clicks collectively weigh 5.91 grams, and one click weighs around approximately 2.86 grams. The internal task skeleton weighs around 4.61 grams, and the top shell's side buttons with their unique larger design weigh a little more than usual, weighing around 1.41 grams. Now moving on to the base shell, which as you can see is a solid type, unlike the bases used on LAMZU's previous products. Obviously it weighs a little bit more, weighing around 8.24 grams, and the bottom power slider button adds an additional 0.22 grams to the base's overall weight. Next, the mouse's scroll wheel with its thicker rubber texturing weighs around 1.93 grams, and the mouse's battery weighs around 4.81 grams, but keep in mind this is the smaller pre-production unit battery. The retail units have a 300 mAh battery which weighs around 0.20 grams more, bringing the weight of the retail batch's battery to around 5 grams. Next, the main PCB weighs around 6.59 grams, the side button PCB with its ribbon cable weighs around 1.14 grams, and the main click PCB with the ribbon cable weighs around 4.37 grams, and lastly, all of the screws inside the Thorn V2 collectively weigh around 1.39 grams. Alrighty, and with that, that is everything for the mouse's individual component weights. Alright, now starting off with the base shell reassembly process, this is going to be a pretty straightforward process as there really isn't too much to worry about here. However, we do have a slider switch in the bottom of the PCB, which is something we will need to keep a very close eye on, as if this is damaged it will of course render the mouse inoperable. Now thankfully LAMZU has designed this switch in a pretty smart way here, where as you can see there's a very tiny little lip at the top of the slider switch, meaning that it's impossible to install the switch incorrectly, which is really nice to see. I wish more brands would do this because sometimes these can be a nightmare to align, and you want to orient it into its topmost position just like that. Next on the mouse's PCB, as you can see here, there is that aforementioned slider switch. Now what you want to do is you want to orient it into the upper position, which is off, as that will correspond to the slider here. And once this is oriented into its uppermost position, this is also oriented into its uppermost position, you can take the PCB, gently align it into the front of the shell like that, and you can gently drop it into place. Now you might need to shift it forward a little bit for the USB-C port to align, but it should clip in roughly like that. Now before you press it down, make sure that the slider switch has not moved, which it hasn't in our case, and once that's done, you can just take your thumb, press down, and click the PCB onto its standoffs just like that. Now, if the PCB does not go down naturally, do not force it because that means the slider switch is misaligned. Remove the PCB, realign the switch and the slider button and try again. It should just naturally clip down in all cases. You shouldn't need to force it down. And once you've gently re-anchored the main PCB, you can flip the shell over and just double check that this is functional, which it is. You'll actually feel the switch moving, so we're good to go there. And then you can flip this over, and then you can re-anchor the 3 screws for the PCB. However, due to the more flexible design of the base here, do not over-tension these screws as you can cause the base to warp or wobble a little bit if they're over-tensioned, so make sure just to gently tension all these screws. And then once these anchoring screws are installed, just to be safe, take your mouse, go put it on a completely flat surface, and make sure there's no wobbling to the base. If there is, just untension all the screws and retension them very, very slightly to make sure you don't cause any wobbling to the base. Alright, and then next up we're going to go ahead and reinstall the mouse's battery. Now if you're going to put a heavier battery, I would recommend orient it closer to the midline, something like this. If you're going to put a lighter battery, I'd recommend putting it more towards the back of the shell, but depending on the battery type and its capacity and a bunch of other factors, the positioning will have to vary a little bit. And also be mindful to make sure to orient the battery close to the mouse's Y-axis, as if it's misoriented like this, it will of course cause more unbalancing to the mouse, so keep that in mind. Now in my case, the stock battery was positioned kind of like that. I could be very wrong, but again, this is why I don't recommend removing the battery unless you're going to replace it with a new one, because again, if this is altered, it's going to skew the mouse's balancing. So again, to avoid my situation, I'd recommend keeping it in place. And once the battery is repositioned, you can go ahead and reinstall the JST connector by slotting it in, pushing down on the sides, just like that. Alrighty, and then once that's done, flip the mouse over, turn the mouse on, and verify this LED indicator turns on. If you want to, you can plug it into your computer via the USB-C port or connect it wirelessly to just make sure the mouse still turns on. If for whatever reason your mouse doesn't turn on, it's most likely an issue with the switch, or maybe this JST connector isn't fully seated, but both of those are relatively easy to troubleshoot, so I'm not going to walk through that, but just make sure everything works before you move forward. Alright, that is everything for the mouse's base shell reassembly, a pretty simple process overall, which is nice to see. We'll put this off to the side for now, and now we can go ahead and reassemble the internal cage-like structure. Now before we reassemble the skeleton, what I'd recommend doing is taking the ribbon cable for the side button PCBs and connecting it to the main PCB, as it's much easier to work with this cable when it's connected like this as opposed to the side button PCB. Next, what we can also do is take the scroll wheel and reinstall it, which is very easy, as all you have to do is take the thinner end of the wheel and put it into that hole in the encoder just like that. However, because there are standoffs in this cage-like structure, don't push it in all the way. I'd recommend installing it like this, as there's enough tolerance for the standoffs there. Just make sure your wheel isn't pushed in all the way like that, as it won't actually sit into the internal cage-like structure properly. Next up, take the ribbon cables and thread them through this large hole in the bottom there. So you just want to guide them in and get them to go through there. And then once they're in place, you want to put the PCB in at an angle like this and basically just rest it into place as best you can. Now you might have to fiddle with it a little bit to get it into place, because these plastic clips can make it a little tricky. But once you get it into place, you can press it down and you can verify its position properly. As you can see, the plastic standoffs are roughly even with the PCB surface. Alright, and then once the PCB is reinstalled, we can go ahead and reinstall the 4 anchoring screws that go here, 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 and here. Alright, and then once all those screws are installed, verify the PCB is in place with those plastic clips towards the back, and just make sure everything looks straight there. Now the wheel, if it's off by a little bit, you can push it in just a tiny bit to re-anchor it a little better into the shell, just like that. But even if it's a little loose feeling, it will be held in place by these little standoffs and the top shell, so don't worry about it if it feels a little loose. Next, we can move on to the side button PCB, which is going to be fairly easy to reinstall. Firstly, what we need to do is we need to take this ribbon cable and run it through the top shell here, just like that. Then we can take our side button PCB, open up this little ribbon connector, and you want to slide it into this connector, just like that. And then once it's in place, you want to anchor it down with that clip, and it should look roughly like that. Once that's reinstalled, see these tiny little slots here? You want to take the PCB and basically just align it into those little slots, very similar to how like side buttons are anchored in the top shell. And you just want to push it down into place enough where this plastic clip should pop over top to hold it in place. Sometimes the clip needs a little bit of motivation, which you can do by just pressing the back of it there. And once it's installed, make sure that it's sitting as flush as possible. If it's off on an angle or not installed all the way, the side buttons will not function. So make sure this is clipped down as much as possible, just like that. Alright, now that all the components are reinstalled into the task skeleton here, before you move on and install it into the top shell, what I recommend doing is connecting it to the main PCB, which you can do so quite easily by reconnecting this large ribbon cable here. Again, be very careful with it because they are rather fragile. And once connected, and while being mindful not to put too much pressure onto the cables, flip the mouse over, turn it on, and verify everything functions. So verify that your side buttons work, verify the main click, the scroll wheel click, and of course the encoder all work. Now, if there's an issue with the cables, it's most likely because one of these ribbon cables isn't properly seated. So go ahead, disconnect this one and this one, see if that fixes the issue, and then if that doesn't work, test the one from here to here for the side button specifically. Now, most of the time ribbon cables are relatively cooperative, so you shouldn't have any major issues, but sometimes they can be a little finicky, which is why I recommend testing the functionality of everything before we move on, as it's much easier to fix fix an issue with the ribbon cables now as opposed to when it's installed into the top shell. So make sure to take a moment and test the functionality of the mouse before you move forward. But once you've verified everything is functional, you can turn the mouse off, again being mindful not to put too much strain on the ribbon cables, disconnect it from the main PCB just like that. And once we've verified everything is functional, we can go ahead and reassemble this into the top shell, and we'll go ahead and talk about that next. Alright, now before we reinstall the task skeleton into the top shell, we will need to reinstall the side buttons, which thankfully is a very easy process, as all you have to do is take the little nubs on the end of the side buttons and reinstall them into these tiny little slits located right here and here. Now I like to start with the forward one, so you can kind of pop it in there, and then the same thing with this one, just like that, press them down into place, and you can verify they're installed properly as the side buttons will kind of poke out of the shell just like that, and you can press them to make sure they are properly functional, which they are in our case. With that done, now we can go ahead and reinstall the central structure here. Now, just like when we removed this structure, these front pegs are going to be an issue as they are a little difficult to work with when reassembling this structure here. Now, what I recommend doing is putting the structure in on an angle, and as best you can, try and line up the pegs with their standoffs. And basically what you want to do is you want to peel the shell open and push this whole structure down as best as you can, while also making sure this aligns with their top pegs like that. It can be a bit of a process and it can take a couple tries, but as long as the skeleton goes into the shell and is roughly aligned with the top standoffs, that's pretty much all you need to do. And then once that's done, you can go ahead and press these down into place. Now, I wouldn't use your thumb for this because there are some exposed solder points there and they are rather sharp, so just to prevent poking yourself, what I recommend doing is taking something soft or like the bottom of a screwdriver and basically just forcing them down into place, which seems a little sus. But with enough pressure, you can click it into place just like that. And then you can also press down in the middle here to make sure this is all connected as well. And just to verify this is installed properly, test your scroll wheel to make sure it is scrolling properly. If it's not scrolling properly, there's most likely a misalignment that's causing an issue here. I would also recommend testing your side buttons to make sure they're sitting properly. They might not feel the best right now because the shells aren't fully connected, but just make sure they actually click. Once that's done, what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and take those 3 anchoring screws you removed earlier, and we're going to connect them to the standoffs here, here, and here. Now, the reason why we did this before we reinstalled the main clicks is because these screws is what anchors the skeleton into the top shell, and we obviously don't want this shifting around when we reinstall the main clicks because that can cause problems, which is why we did this in the opposite order than we did earlier. And then once the skeleton structure is re-anchored, next we can go ahead and re-anchor our main clicks, which is a relatively easy process. Firstly, what you're going to do is you want to take the back of the click and put it in through this little hole in the top shell, and then what you want to do is see this kind of open brace kind of archway here. That has to go over this tiny little standoff right here. So you want to orient it into the shell, flip the shell over, and kind of using the inside as a guide, you want to push it into place. And once it's in place, take a pry tool and gently press it down, just like that. Just again, be very mindful of the ribbon cables. And you can verify they're in properly as the click will function 1. And as you can see here, there's also not a gap between the click height and the top shell height, which is exactly what we want to see. Once that click is installed, orient the shell and to rest more on its back like this. You don't want to put pressure on the clicks themselves as it can obviously knock it loose. Orient it like this, give it one final push, and you can go ahead and reinstall the anchoring screw for the main click, which is a little tricky. Just be mindful of the cables. However, as I've said multiple times here on the channel before, be very careful when anchoring these screws, as if they're over or under tensioned, it can affect the click feel and or break them completely. Only screw this in until you feel the slightest feedback. Do not over tension them under any circumstances. All right, once that's done, we can go ahead and do the same process for the next click. So we'll put it in through the top of the shell, line it up as best as we can, kind of using these standoffs as a guide. We'll click it into place and angling the shell to sit on its back and giving the click one final push into place. We'll go ahead and re-anchor the screw. Now, once the main clicks are reinstalled, flip the shell over and number 1, test your clicks to make sure they're functional. Now, the clicks should sit very high up in the shell like this. However, if they sit really high in the shell like this and they feel very heavy to actuate, you've over-tensioned the clicks, which will cause issues. And if the screw is under tension, the clicks will sit a little lower like this. But if you followed my instructions and only screwed the anchoring screw into, you felt a little bit of feedback, the clicks should sit just like this. You should have a natural buoyancy to them when they get clicked. just like that. So double check to make sure your clicks are operating as intended, and if needed, you can adjust the tensioning of the screw here. But as always, it's better to under tension than over tension the screws, as once you over tension them, that's pretty much DOA. There's not a lot you can do about that. So again, be very, very careful with these anchoring screws here. And once the main clicks are reinstalled, flip the shell over, gently pull this ribbon cable back, and push the side button ribbon cable into the shell as best as you can. And this ribbon cable can stay up like that, and it doesn't matter in that case. All right, and once that's done, we can go ahead and grab our base shell, and now we can go ahead and reassemble the top and base shells. Alright, now to reassemble the shells, this is going to be pretty easy, as all we have to do is reconnect this one ribbon cable here by setting this connector into its open position by just pulling it up like this. However, I did notice on both of my Thorn V2 units, this connector is a little loose, meaning if it's held at an angle, gravity can cause it to close, which makes reassembling this a little tricky. As such, pull it into the open position, and I recommend keeping it vertical like this so gravity doesn't close it on you. And once you've done that, you can just gently put the shells together, grab this ribbon cable, and just gently slot it into the connector. You want the blue to be just barely visible above the connector, clip it down into place just like that. And then once the shells are loosely connected, just loosely put them together, flip the mouse over, turn the mouse on, and verify everything functions. So verify the clicks, side clicks, scroll wheel click, check the sensor, just check all the functionality on the mouse before you continue. Now, if something isn't working, it's most likely a connection from this ribbon cable, so just disconnect it, reseat it, and that should fix your issues. All right, and then once you've verified everything is functional, go ahead and just flip the mouse off, and now we can take the top and base shells, gently align them together. I'd recommend starting with the front of the shell like this, clip it in, and then run your thumb along the side of the shell to clip everything into place. Now, the clips in the shell are located here, here, and here, so I recommend focusing on those areas and just make sure everything makes a tight seam before you move forward. And lastly, you can go ahead and reinstall the 4 anchoring screws for the mouse's base. And then with those screws installed, just put the mouse on a flat surface again, just to make sure there's no base wobble, as sometimes these screws can cause a tiny little bit of wobble on the base, but it's very rare. But if there is a little bit of wobble, just untension the screws and make sure they're all tensioned evenly, and that should fix your issue. And once you verify there's no base wobble, you can go ahead and reinstall your preferred set of skates on the mouse's base. And with that, that is everything for the teardown of the Thorn V2 itself. But as always here on the channel, we're of course going to tear down the new orbital receiver as well. So let's move on to that next. Alright, now as a preface to this, I do not recommend disassembling the receiver, as if you damage the antenna or any of its internal components, you will render it inoperable, so I would not recommend doing this. I just want to show you guys how it's designed on the inside. Now, firstly, what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and remove the rubber base on the bottom, which we can do by taking a pry tool or a fingernail and just very gently peeling up a corner, and then very gently we're just going to peel this back. Just make sure to do it slowly as to not damage the adhesive layer, and with a little bit of prying, it comes off like that. And with that removed, we can see 4 screws on the base, which we will remove. And then with those screws removed, to open the dongle, we have to open this little seam right here. Now, a fingernail usually works the best, but you can also use a pry tool to gently just kind of force it open. And we'll do that on both sides. Now, be careful when doing this as to not damage any of the internal components, but you can separate it just like that. And here we can see the large weight added to the dongle to make it a little heftier, which is a nice little attention to detail. And then in the top here, we can see the PCB, but as you can see, it's just being kind of held in by some pegs. Now, there are 2 ways to remove it. Either A, you can take a pry tool and very gently pull it up from the corner and remove it, or you can do the other method, which I like a little more, is you can flip it over and just tap the dongle enough where it just falls out. Now, the reason why you need to be so careful with this is, as I talked about earlier, this also has this large antenna design to complement the one on the main PCB, and due to its pronounced nature, if it's damaged, it will of course affect the mouse's connectivity, so you need to be very careful when handling this, so keep that in mind. And in the middle of this little receiver PCB, we have another Nordic 54 series SoC, specifically the 54H20, to complement the one inside the mouse. And circling back to the top here, there are also these small little light threaders for the front indicator LEDs. However, due to the design of the dongle, they are really hard to reinstall if you disconnect them, so I would not remove them, as they're a nightmare to get back in. So I would recommend just leaving them in place. Now, to reinstall the dongle, you want to orient the PCB with the USB-C port facing the back, and you want to orient the top shell the same way. And what I'd recommend doing is taking a pair of tweezers, hold the PCB, and you just want to gently drop it into the top shell. Now, it might take a couple tries to do this due to the thinner work area here, but you want to orient it and just kind of drop it into place place just like that. Now, once it's inside, double check to make sure it's actually aligned properly, as sometimes the PCB can look like it's installed properly, but it's actually misaligned. So what I recommend doing is once it's in place, just take your finger and push it down into place to verify everything is properly connected. Once that's done, we can take the base we removed earlier and just clip it onto the bottom. And again, just make sure the USB-C port is still aligned. And once that's done, we can go ahead and reinstall the 4 anchoring screws on the base. And once those are installed, make sure the seam between the top shell and the base shell is solid there, and of course make sure the USB-C port is still connected. And lastly, we can go ahead and take the base we removed earlier and just gently reinstall it over there. Now you might have to add additional adhesive to this if it tore off earlier when you removed it, but it should go back into place just like that. And with that, that is how you disassemble and reassemble the Thorn V2's new orbiter receiver. Alrighty, well in closing, overall the LAMZU Thorn V2, for this being my first experience with a LAMZU product, is a semi-serviceable mouse. Admittedly, the mouse itself can be a little tricky to work with due to the added internal skeleton, as it has a more complex disassembly process, but nothing crazy complicated, which is nice to see. Just more of an old style of disassembly. But regardless, the design of the mouse is great and it is easy to service, specifically the battery, which is nice to see, and there's a lot of install area for modding the battery, which is another great attention to detail. And even though all the components inside the mouse are soldered to their various PCBs, the PCBs themselves are modular, and if you're comfortable soldering, there's a lot of modding you can do to the Thorn V2, which is really nice to see. But with that, that's everything for today's episode of Teardown. Thank you very much for watching. If you haven't already, be sure to go check out my full review of the Thorn V2. This mouse actually impressed me so much, it is now my daily driver ergo mouse, dethroning the DeathAdder V4 Pro that I've made for about a year now, as LAMZU did a great job with designing the Thorn V2 here, and with its improved specs and its altered shell, this mouse feels very similar to like a larger Vaxi Outset AX, which is my all-time favorite ergo shaping, which is partially why I like this mouse so much, as it feels great in my larger hands. So if you're in the market for a larger ergo mouse with a very Outset AX adjacent shaping with great performance and build quality and of course good serviceability, be sure to check out the Thorn V2. But with that, that's everything for today's episode of Teardown. Thank you very much for watching, and a big thanks to LAMZU for sending the Thorn V2 over for a review. If you enjoyed the Teardown and found this video helpful, please consider leaving a like on this video or getting subscribed to the channel, as that is one of the best ways to directly support the channel. Alternatively, becoming a channel member is another great way of supporting the channel, as members make videos like this possible. So if you want to support my work here on the channel with the Teardown project, the in-depth reviews, and of course all the other things I do here on the channel, consider becoming a member today, as that gives you ad-free early access to all upcoming content. But that's everything for today's episode of Teardown. Thanks again for watching, and I'll catch you all in the next episode. Peace.